I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
For 27 minutes, King Charles and Princess Anne were completely alone. No private secretaries, no senior courtiers, no family advisors waiting beside them. Then the door opened. Anne walked out first, her expression frozen, while Charles remained seated inside, without calling anyone back. Now, a palace insider has revealed the explosive subject of that final private meeting, and why one sentence from the king changed the relationship between brother and sister forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles requested the conversation after a week of tense family discussions, expecting control from the moment Anne arrived. The king dismissed every aide, leaving no private secretary or courtier inside. A private advisory role means trusted, unofficial influence over sensitive choices behind closed doors. Anne had expected a brief exchange. Instead, she watched her brother turn family trust into authority. Charles told her plainly that he intended to reduce her private advisory role in future royal family decisions and move influence over sensitive matters to a smaller circle around the sovereign and William. The sovereign means the reigning monarch, the person occupying the throne. Anne did not argue. She placed her gloves beside the chair, looked directly at him, and asked whether the decision was his own. Charles hesitated. Once. That pause cut deeper than any speech. Anne felt betrayed, yet kept her voice low. Charles grew defensive, and insisted the monarchy could no longer depend on old family arrangements. The monarchy is the royal system centered on the reigning king and the institution around the crown. She answered that loyalty should not become inconvenient simply because the crown had entered a difficult period. He stiffened. The insider, speaking through a documented private account shared with a palace intermediary, described the king setting his pen down sharply when Anne mentioned their late mother. Charles warned her not to use Queen Elizabeth's memory as leverage. Anne revealed she already knew changes were being discussed. What hurt was learning decisions had apparently been made before her brother chose to speak. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had spent years offering blunt advice when others softened their words. Now she understood honesty itself may have become the problem. Anne rose, gathered her gloves, and asked one final question. Does William know exactly what you're doing? Charles did not answer immediately. His silence followed her to the door. Because the real shock was not merely that Anne was being pushed aside, it was that Charles may have misunderstood the one person who had spent a lifetime standing beside him. To understand why Anne's face changed inside that room, you have to understand what Charles was asking her to surrender. This was not a ceremonial responsibility, written neatly into a palace handbook. It was something built across decades of family crisis, private grief, and brutal responsibility. Charles had leaned on his sister when the cameras disappeared. Anne had answered without demanding applause. And suddenly, the very bond that made her indispensable had become the reason she could be removed. Charles had always carried pressure differently. The king could be sensitive, uncertain, and deeply affected by criticism, while Anne had trained herself to meet difficulty with discipline and uncomfortable honesty. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had never controlled constitutional decisions, meaning formal choices tied to the legal powers of the crown. Yet her private importance came from something harder to measure. Her brother repeatedly sought her judgment before painful family conversations, because she would tell him what others were too cautious to say. Charles remained alone after the meeting, staring at the untouched glass beside him. Anger had protected him while Anne was present, but sadness now slipped through. The monarch remembered private calls during family crises, late conversations when she had challenged him, and moments when his sister had defended him without asking anyone to notice. He had wanted clearer boundaries. Suddenly, those boundaries felt colder than he expected. Anne walked through the corridor, carrying a humiliation she rarely allowed herself to feel. She was not broken by losing influence. The trusted sister was wounded because Charles had treated decades of trust like an administrative arrangement that could simply be revised. A longtime courtier greeted her and immediately noticed the silence. She stopped, steadied herself, and asked only for her car. The princess tightened one glove, then tightened it again. Her hands were trembling. Anne remembered something Charles apparently had not mentioned. During a recent private disagreement involving senior family members, she had defended her brother when criticism turned harsh. She had argued that the king deserved room to decide without being cornered by competing voices. The sister who now felt excluded had protected the same man who seemed to question her loyalty. That contradiction hurt more than the reduced access itself. The insider's documented account then pointed palace attention toward one earlier incident. Charles had not always viewed Anne's directness as resistance. Something had changed. One conversation had shifted the meaning of her honesty in his mind, turning protection into challenge. And when palace staff looked back at the weeks before the meeting, one confrontation stood out as the moment everything began to crack. The rupture did not begin behind the closed door at Windsor. It began 3 weeks earlier, during a private family dinner that was supposed to calm tensions. There were no speeches and no official papers on the table. Yet by the time the evening ended, Charles had left furious, Anne had refused to withdraw a single word, and William had witnessed the moment both siblings crossed an emotional line neither would easily retreat from. Charles entered that dinner, already convinced the family needed fewer voices around difficult decisions. The king believed leaks, competing loyalties, and endless arguments were weakening his control whenever private disputes erupted. An advisory circle means the small group of trusted people allowed to give direct guidance before sensitive choices are made. He wanted that circle tighter, faster, and easier to manage. Anne listened carefully. William watched both of them, sensing the danger before either sibling raised a voice. Charles explained that future family conflicts could not be discussed by too many people. He wanted quicker decisions and clearer responsibility. Anne waited until her brother finished, then answered with brutal calm. A smaller circle does not guarantee better judgment. The Princess Royal did not shout. She did not soften the sentence either. Charles stared at her, instantly hearing more than criticism. With his son sitting opposite them, the monarch felt his authority had been challenged in front of the man who would one day inherit the crown. William moved quickly to lower the temperature. The prince said responsibilities should be defined before names were discussed, because structure mattered more than personalities. Anne agreed. Charles heard something else. He heard his son siding with his aunt. The future king tried to clarify, but the damage had already begun. His father grew quieter, and that silence carried more anger than an argument. Charles suddenly pushed his chair backwards before dessert arrived. The king left without another word. Anne remained seated, staring at the folded napkin before her. William said her name and started to rise, but she stopped him. The princess told him not to follow his father. Charles, she said, needed to decide whether he wanted honest counsel or obedient silence. William stayed where he was, but he never forgot the sentence. The consequence came fast. Within 48 hours, Charles requested a private review of how sensitive family advice reached him. The review was an internal examination of who influenced confidential discussions and how those opinions entered the king's decisions. Anne's name appeared repeatedly in the documented notes. Her advice had once looked like protection. Now, to Charles, it seemed dangerously close to resistance. Anne later entered the final private meeting, expecting that dinner to return. What she did not know was that Charles had carried one sentence from that night like a wound. So when Charles finally repeated Anne's own words back to her, the meeting stopped being about royal structure and became a confrontation between brother and sister. There are questions that are not truly questions. They are wounds demanding an answer. Halfway through the private meeting, Charles leaned forward and asked Anne whether she believed he was weak. The Princess Royal had seconds to decide whether to comfort her brother or tell the truth as she saw it. She chose honesty. What followed was the most personal exchange of the meeting, and the moment the king finally lost his composure. Charles repeated the sentence from the family dinner slowly, forcing Anne to hear her own words again. The king asked why she had challenged his plan, with William sitting there. A royal advisory plan means the private structure used to decide who gives direct guidance on sensitive family matters. His anger was not only about policy. He believed his sister had questioned him in front of the future king, and that made the criticism feel like humiliation. Anne refused to retreat. She told Charles her concern had never been his authority. The princess believed removing experienced voices during a period of family tension would leave her brother surrounded by people too careful to disagree with him. That mattered because private family disputes were already becoming harder to contain, and because the monarch was carrying pressure that made isolation dangerous. Charles listened, but every word seemed to tighten something inside him. Charles finally asked, "Do you think I am weak?" Anne looked directly at him. "I think you are tired, and tired men sometimes confuse agreement with loyalty." The sentence landed instantly. The king rose from his chair and accused her of judging him when she should have been supporting him. Anne stood too. She reminded her brother that she had spent decades carrying responsibility without complaint, and would not now be spoken to as though honesty were betrayal. Charles reached for a folder, then stopped. The monarch left it unopened. Anne noticed and asked what was inside. A confidential folder is simply a file containing private material not intended for public circulation. He told her the contents were irrelevant. She answered that nothing placed between them that day felt irrelevant. For 1 second, neither moved. Charles then admitted senior advisors had warned him Anne's private influence could complicate future decisions. The king gave no names. His sister asked again. He refused again. That was the moment the princess understood this conflict stretched beyond two siblings. Anne's voice dropped. Someone near him, she said, was teaching him to remove every person willing to challenge him privately. Charles did not deny it quickly enough. But the question of who influenced Charles mattered less than one brutal reality. The crown belonged to him, and he was preparing to prove it. Royal power is often misunderstood. The loudest voice is not always the most dangerous, and the person nearest the monarch does not always hold formal authority. Anne's influence had existed in a quieter space, built on access, trust, and the freedom to tell Charles what others softened. But in that private room, the king made something painfully clear. Access could be reduced, trust could be redefined, and even a sister could discover that the door beside the throne had a lock. Charles controlled the people invited into his closest private discussions, and that control mattered, because Anne's influence had never been guaranteed by law. The king relied on personal trust, not a constitutional entitlement, meaning she held no formal right to advise him simply because they were siblings. He now wanted a smaller circle, built around himself, William, and selected senior advisors. The aim was speed. Fewer voices meant faster choices. But fewer voices also meant fewer people willing to challenge him. William received a brief message confirming that his father and aunt had met alone. The prince read it twice. Unease settled quickly, because Charles had discussed reform with him, but never the full details of reducing Anne's role. The future king understood why clearer responsibilities mattered. He did not yet understand how far his father intended to go, and that difference would soon become dangerous. Charles turned back to Anne and told her that being his sister did not grant permanent access to every private matter. The monarch spoke coldly now, as though distance might make the decision easier. Anne answered that she had never demanded access. Her brother had called her during crises. He had asked for her judgment when family arguments became too painful and when other voices became too cautious. She had entered those rooms because Charles wanted her there. Anne pushed the unopened folder gently toward him. The file represented a future arrangement, a planned way of deciding who would join sensitive royal discussions. She told Charles she did not need to read it to recognize a decision already made. The king placed one hand over the folder. He said nothing. His silence confirmed more than any page could have done. Anne then heard the phrase that changed everything. Charles called the plan a future arrangement. The insider's documented account preserved those exact words, showing that the decision was not temporary. The princess understood her exclusion could outlive the argument itself. Anne left without threatening her brother. Charles assumed silence meant surrender. He was wrong. Before her car reached the Windsor gates, she had decided exactly how she would respond, and by the following morning, the first consequences of that decision were already moving through the family. Anne did not issue a threat. She did not demand an apology. She did something far more unsettling. She stopped volunteering. By the next morning, a family call went unanswered. A private briefing was returned with a 2-line response. And when Charles expected his sister's opinion on a sensitive matter, the Princess Royal offered none. The king had wanted clearer boundaries. Suddenly, he was discovering what those boundaries felt like when Anne chose to respect them completely. Anne followed her brother's new expectations with absolute precision. She would complete every formal royal duty, but she would no longer step into private family disputes unless Charles directly asked her. A private briefing is a confidential summary prepared to help senior royals understand sensitive matters before decisions are made. Her withdrawal mattered because she had often ended small tensions before they reached the king, using blunt calls and quiet conversations to stop disagreements from becoming crises. Charles felt the absence almost immediately. The monarch received a briefing about a family scheduling dispute and asked, without thinking, "What does Anne think?" An aide paused before explaining that his sister had offered no view. The king looked down at the papers. He said nothing. For years, her opinion had irritated him, steadied him, and sometimes saved him from acting too quickly. Now the silence he had created sat directly in front of him. Anne sat alone with official papers and noticed a personal message waiting on her phone. She ignored it for several minutes. When the princess finally read it, sadness returned. But anger did not take control. She would not punish Charles. Her brother was still the king, and he was still family. Yet she would not pretend their meeting had changed nothing. Quiet resolve replaced humiliation. William telephoned his aunt later that day. The prince heard warmth in her voice until he mentioned his father. Anne immediately changed the subject and asked about his schedule. The future king understood the gesture. She was protecting him from being forced to choose between Charles and herself. But that protection only made him more uneasy. William then learned something disturbing through a confidential family account. Charles had presented the smaller advisory arrangement as a plan his son broadly supported. The prince did support clearer responsibilities. He had never agreed to removing Anne's private voice completely. Suddenly, he understood how dangerously his position had been interpreted. William stopped relying on messages. He decided to see his aunt personally, without secretaries, aides, or carefully prepared language between them. Anne agreed, because when William finally sat opposite his aunt in private, Anne heard the one thing Charles had failed to tell her. There was no formal agenda when William met Anne. No folder waited between them. No advisor prepared careful language. The future king simply sat down and told his aunt the truth. He had supported clearer lines of responsibility, but he had never asked Charles to silence her. For the first time since the Windsor meeting, Anne's composure cracked. Not because the conflict was solved, but because she finally understood how deeply misunderstanding had driven the family apart. William had requested the private conversation after realizing his position had been stretched far beyond what he intended. The prince supported reform because the monarchy needed clearer responsibilities and faster decisions during family crises. Reform, in this context, meant changing the private working structure around royal decision-making rather than altering the legal crown itself. Yet he also believed trusted relatives had to retain the freedom to challenge both the sovereign and the heir. Without that honesty, speed could become isolation. Anne listened without interrupting. Then the princess asked the question she had clearly been carrying since the meeting with Charles. Did William want her removed from sensitive family conversations? The future king answered immediately, no. She looked away. Several seconds passed before his aunt spoke again, and when she did, her voice had lost its usual steel. Anne admitted Charles had made her feel as though honesty itself had become a liability. Her brother had asked for blunt advice for years, yet the king now seemed wounded by the very directness he once depended upon. William defended his father carefully. The monarch was under enormous pressure, but the prince also admitted exhaustion and defensiveness may have shaped the decision more than Charles wanted to acknowledge. William watched Anne open a notebook and pretend to study the page. The prince reached across the table and closed it. He told his aunt this was not a council meeting. A council meeting is a formal discussion where official matters are considered through structured roles and prepared business. She did not need to hide behind work. Anne stared at him, then finally said, "He is my brother. That is why it hurt." William then revealed the full misunderstanding. Charles had used his son's support for structural reform when defending the smaller circle, but the king had never shown him what Anne's reduced role would actually mean. The future king felt anger rise. His position had become part of an argument he had never agreed to make. Anne did not ask William to defend her. She asked for something harder. "Tell Charles the truth," she said, before a private wound became a public war. But the palace had already waited too long, because outside Windsor's walls, the story of the closed-door meeting was beginning to break. By sunrise, the argument no longer belonged to Charles and Anne. It belonged to millions. A leaked account of the private meeting reached the press, and one headline transformed a painful sibling confrontation into a royal power struggle. Suddenly, every silence became evidence. Every cancelled appearance became a clue. Yet behind the spectacle, Charles was staring at the front page in disbelief, while Anne faced the one outcome she had tried hardest to avoid. Selected details from Windsor had escaped into public view, including the discussion about reducing Anne's future private advisory involvement. Charles knew denying the meeting was impossible. The king also understood that explaining it could expose the deeper family argument. Private advisory involvement means unofficial access to confidential family discussions before sensitive choices are settled. The palace faced a cruel trap. Say too little, and suspicion would grow. Say too much, and a brother's mistake would become national entertainment. Outside a Windsor newsstand, the damage became impossible to contain. A newspaper carried the enormous headline, "Sister Shut Out, King's Private Clash with Anne." People gathered around it, raising phones and photographing the page. Broadcasters began repeating one phrase, "Royal rupture." The term meant a serious break inside the royal family, and within hours, it was everywhere. A private wound had been given a public name. Charles saw the front page at breakfast and pushed it away before finishing the first paragraph. Anger came first, then guilt. The monarch realized his sister would now be portrayed as either disloyal for challenging him or defeated for being pushed aside. Neither version captured Anne. He knew that. The knowledge made the coverage harder to bear. Anne was preparing for an engagement when an aide nervously showed her the headline. The princess read it once, handed the device back, and said, "We go on time." Her calm was deliberate. She would not allow Charles's decision or the press storm to disrupt her duty. Yet the frustration remained, because the very conflict she had tried to contain was now being consumed by strangers. William moved before the story could harden into accepted truth. The prince privately told his father that he had never approved Anne's complete exclusion. Charles stared at his son as the full misunderstanding finally became clear. The king had used support for reform as support for silence. They were not the same. Charles now faced a brutal choice. He could defend his authority and protect the decision, or admit that fear and exhaustion had distorted his judgment. And in the final conversation that followed, Charles discovered that repairing a crown was easier than repairing trust with the sister who remembered him before he wore it. The final resolution did not arrive through a decree, a public statement, or a carefully rehearsed palace announcement. It arrived when Charles asked Anne to come back into the room. This time, no folder sat between them. No restructuring language protected either sibling from the truth. The king had spent days defending his authority. Anne had spent days protecting her dignity. Now both understood the same painful lesson. A monarchy could survive disagreement, but a family could be destroyed by silence. Charles requested the conversation after William finally clarified that he had never supported removing his aunt's independent voice completely. The king did not abandon every proposed change. A decision-making structure means the small working arrangement used to decide who joins sensitive discussions and how responsibilities are divided. The tighter system would remain, because the monarchy still needed clearer roles and faster choices. But the monarch now understood that reform and exclusion were not the same thing. Charles looked at Anne and admitted what pride had hidden. Her criticism had felt like a judgment on his strength. The king had heard directness and mistaken it for disloyalty. He told his sister he had been wrong. Anne did not interrupt. She let her brother finish, because this time he was not speaking as a sovereign defending control. He was speaking as a tired man admitting fear. Anne moved the chair beside her slightly closer. The princess told Charles she had never needed a position inside his circle. She needed to know that he still wanted the truth when the truth became uncomfortable. Her brother listened. That distinction mattered because their bond had never depended on official power. It had survived through private honesty when royal pressure made honesty difficult. Charles restored a direct private channel between them for major family matters. A direct private channel simply meant Anne could speak to him personally about serious concerns without passing every thought through advisors. She accepted with one condition: her advice would remain honest, even when he hated hearing it. The king gave a tired laugh. That, he said, was exactly the problem, and exactly why he needed her. William's place became clearer too. The prince would take a stronger role in future planning, but Anne would not be treated as an obstacle to the next generation. Her experience became a bridge, not a rival source of influence. The meeting had exposed Charles's sensitivity to doubt and Anne's refusal to soften truth. Yet it did not destroy them. It forced brother and sister to speak before silence became permanent. In the end, the leak exposed a royal confrontation, but the true verdict was far more human. Charles nearly pushed away the sister who challenged him because she was still one of the few people brave enough to love him without simply agreeing with him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.